Welcome to today's webinar, When Silence is Strategic and as Power Dissipates. We'll be focusing today's discussion on an interview. We'll commence the webinar of Bill Whitelaw, who's recently authored, and it was this that caught my attention, Bill. Your article in Troy Media on silence is accelerating Alberta's democratic decline, with the fear of repercussions is driving moderates away from participating in public debate. Well, certainly not us, but your background, for those who don't know you, is that you're an executive director of Rextag in Calgary. You're a senior and have been a senior energy executive, skilled across a broad base of strategic and operational functions, with the key focus, and this is what's caught my attention, key focus on public policy, very important today, government affairs, and evolution of the resource sector, clearly here in Alberta. Your experience has been complemented by extensive corporate and nonprofit board experience. My introduction would be as follows, and I'm going to draw on the material that was introductory in today's or in this weekend's newsletter that was entitled "When Silence is Strategic," because we differ a little bit on this as power dissipates. Bureaucrats know what I'm going to share well. If they wait long enough, and the status quo will return, except when it doesn't. That every age flatters itself by believing it is uniquely polarized, ours in particular. Ours is, however, industrialized polarization. It's become so systemic that it seems to me no matter what the issue is, it becomes polarized, whether it's what books kids should read in a library or whether or not immigration we should be for or against. Everything's polarized, even stuff very local to our own personal lives, and that every issue gets conscripted. Every question gets weaponized. Every pause is treated as complicity. That's almost the point we want to discuss today. That politics no longer debates outcomes, it sorts identities. It's already concluded what the conclusion is going to be because it falls into one camp or another, and that camp then speaks up and we've got to listen. The issue is either black or white, left or right, legal or illegal, for or against. Choose now, speak loudly, never revise your position. Well, in this environment, the middle, and I think that's what we try to be in these KEI networks without judgment, to be in the middle is mocked by some as weakness. You haven't taken a position. You're insecure. You're irrelevant. Being undecided brands us as cowards. The people that are patient are told they're late. Those that are listening, true listening, are treated as a luxury we can no longer afford. We've got to make decisions now. We've got to get on board. We've got to protest. We've got to make a statement. This, to me, is a profound mistake, and it seemed to be somewhat a profound mistake to you too, Bill. So I've introduced you. You're here. I like your shirt, and it's like to see you back again. So give us a few moments of why this topic, in fact, became of interest to you to the point that you wrote that very interesting and insightful article.
Well, thank you very much, Perry, and welcome to everybody. A number of familiar faces on the webinar, and I think two things are important. Is, I'm a journalist by background. In the end stages of my career, I've been an energy executive for 25 years or so, but I started life as a journalist, and that never leaves you in terms of sort of watching the landscape and being mildly outraged by what you see. And so if I stitch that to I fulfill those needs by being a fellow in the Energy Futures Lab, which is a very cool organization. I've been involved with it for 10 years now, and it's now 10 years old. And we have a view on public policy discourse about how do we radicalize the middle ground, right? And that's an amorphous thing. What's the middle really mean? But in what we see it happening here in Alberta right now, it was a useful framework for me to think about as I watched the tensions mount around the whole, and what I'm trying to figure out is what we're seeing right now. How is this different than the Western alienation dynamics that have percolated for decades in Western Canada? And what I've arrived at as a conclusion is that there's a silencing of what I call the lambs, and that's really the folks in the middle who are, for a variety of reasons, afraid to really put their heads above the parapet, so to speak, and participate in what most folks on this call would describe as civil society, right? In those things. And you can have completely different views politically, but if your linkage between those views is sound democracy, then that's healthy, right? but we're not seeing that. We are so hyperpolarized right now in Alberta, um, that what I've noticed and I've started to converse with people about is, why aren't you speaking up? And a lot of it is a fear of retribution on social media platforms. And so I'm a habitué of Reddit and Blue Sky and a new, really cool new Canadian one called Gander. I'm on X. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Substack. And what I watch very closely is how discussion and dialogue and debate occur on those various platforms. The most insidious of all for bullying of people is LinkedIn, of course, right? And I don't know how that resonates with everybody's experience. But what I decided to do was sort of start calling it as I saw it, and to figure out where were those 440,000 people who signed Thomas Lukaszik's petition. Like, it just seems like I'm part of a lonely crusaders brigade out there of motley soldiers trying to sort of raise our voices, not in opposition to the separation discourse, right? That's not what it's all about, but just to
But
say,
but isn't that what the referendum said? Is we don't want to have one. We don't want to have a public discourse.
no, I think the referendum, and it'd be interesting to hear what others on the call think. I think the referendum is critical actually to
But but that's
draw.
not what but that's not what Lukaszik's
Oh,
position was.
sorry, no, I'm not talking about Thomas Lukaszik's petition now. I've shifted gears and I shouldn't have. I'm
Okay.
talking about the Alberta Prosperity Project's current
Okay.
push,
Okay.
right? And that's the focus of my article is why aren't people speaking up
Right.
against that
Right.
to signal to their fellow Albertans that if you really take Alberta's role in Confederation seriously, speak up, offer some views. But the more and more people I talk to, and the other thing that I'd really like you to sort of dive into here is we tend to universalize the Albertan and not think about the four generations or even the five and six generations of what being Alberta is right now, right? And I really feel sorry for all the grade 12 students in Alberta who are watching this and saying, is this the world I'm going into to graduate into, to go to university and go into the workforce on? And so, but the whole point of my article was enough anecdotal evidence became empirical for me to people say, I just can't take it when I get
Yeah.
beaten up on social media. And my point to them was, well, that's part of the price of being active in a democratic context, right? In
Right.
terms of
Okay. Well, I mean, this is a great introduction. And by the way, Bill, what you have just shared with us about Alberta is, in fact, an international and a global dilemma right now. Every nation, every community, every party is facing something very much like we are. Maybe it's not a referendum, but there are issues that are viewed by some as existential, so grand that individuals are expected to stand up and protest or not. And therein lies one of the dilemmas of individuals in the world today are being asked to make a choice, either join the public parade or take care of yourself. And that was that duality that I referred to during the foreplay to this
that.
exercise is people are having to live in two worlds and quite different from one another. One about who they may well be personally and addressing issues that affect them personally to issues that don't affect them at all, but to which they are asked to take a stand and protest and become an active member of a caring global society. That is one hell of a stretch that my parents didn't have to go through until World War II was announced. My parents didn't have to react or didn't know that some boy in Australia saved his family or some kid got bitten by a spider in Indonesia. And yet, our generation or those to follow us are expected to be people feeling empathy, at least sympathetic to issues that have absolutely nothing immediately to do with them. They've become incredible civil citizens, almost like Orwell saw in 1984.
Well, I think, as before we got officially online and we started, we talked about if we could channel Marshall McLuhan through this. And Marshall McLuhan, very, very important conception of the global village. And he saw back in the 1960s how the boundaries of traditional media kept people in different swim lanes, segregated from each other, and but how those were dissolving and collapsing. And to your point, is when we're so bombarded and subsumed by all those multiple news sources, there's a performative expectation that comes with, well, I better behave a little bit like that. And it creates a tension in somebody how they live their lives. But I'll go back to, a really important point you made. And so when I sort of try to talk to Albertans on both sides of this question, is what I find with people who are of the pure white hot separation sentiment is there's a unique sense that their grievances and concerns are unique in a Canadian context. And so I said, have you ever traveled to the Maritimes and talked to a fisherman about Ottawa? And so we have, even in Canada here as a large geographic confederation with a small population, we have alienation sentiment everywhere. It, my point is that it's in other provinces and other regions. It's based on a civil society discourse that has not here in Alberta. And I made a point in another article that I wrote was I said, if I'm Pierre Poilievre, I'm just pulling my hair out by the roots because Alberta's view of conservative is getting defined by Mitch Sylvester and Jeff Rath, right? In terms of, and what that sends a signal to other folks in the rest of Canada is, well, if that's the price of being a conservative, I'll stick with the Liberals, thank you, right? And so now,
Okay.
folks,
Extremes seem to be getting heard in Alberta, probably because they are extremes. That doesn't mean that Alberta is necessarily extreme, or even that its leader is not committed to a stronger Alberta in a Canadian context.
well, there's some slippery semantics there, and many folks, much better analysts than me, have pointed out the contradiction in a sovereign Alberta, a united Canada. That and look, she's a phenomenal
Well, but
communicator.
look, I'm a sovereign Canadian. I'm a sovereign Canadian within
Now,
Canada. You'll accept that. Why can't I be a sovereign province within a sovereign Canada? I mean,
because
sovereignty simply says personally responsible, adequate resilience, and I will recognize that myself is important in the context of being a public person.
I take your point in the singularity thing, but you've got to see when the premier of your province speaks in that language, that sovereignty association is conflated with, oh, guess what? Now we're telling the federal government we want to appoint our own justices, and so it's
Yeah, yeah,
she's in a tough corner,
yeah,
right, in
okay,
terms of it. But
yeah.
the point I'm making here, and I'd like you all to spread the hashtag I've created, Grapes of Wrath, in terms of because what we need to figure out is, as the rest of Albertans, is how do we send a signal to our other provinces, other to the broader global community? Is in point of fact, there is a very solid middle ground here in Alberta. We're going to resolve this issue amicably. We'll be in confederation for generations to come. But right now, if I do my global media monitoring, I'm watching the Financial Times, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, The Economist, The Washington Post, The New York Times are all focusing on Jeffrey Rath.
Right.
And to the absence of any other, it's the vacuum that's not being filled by folks who want to stand up and say, other than me and some other commentators, to say, hold on, it's not like that as it seems. And so now I'm going to make an allusion here that a number of folks on the call are old enough to remember, but back in the 1980s, Alberta suffered terrible, terrible, terrible international and Canadian embarrassment in the Jim Keegstra dynamic, right? In terms of, and that caused all kinds of angst in the vote. Now that was a different dynamic, and that worked its way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, but and we didn't have the social media machine spinning these things out in nanoseconds that we did then. But a lot of my Rextag is a U.S. company that I happen to be the Canadian representative for, so I end up talking to a lot of money people in New York City and Houston, and they kind of everything from good-natured jibing to you guys need to get your act together because that if it gets too out of control, it's going to scare away investment, and that because money abhors political risk and instability, right? Now, that may be just talking points in terms of, but when there's smoke, there's fire. And so I have to believe that some of that would cause some concern to investment dollars that would flow into the province. So the point of all this, to sum it all up in this part of it, Perry, is just to say, if we had more Albertans in the middle, and that they could be middle of the road conservatives, they could be middle of the road NDPers, just piping up and not necessarily trolling through social media to latch onto a thread by a separational sentiment thread, but just to say, here's what you don't know about Alberta. We get along pretty well with the rest of Canada. I would salute Trevor Toome is doing some remarkable work. University of Calgary economist had a great post. And so what's really fascinating is when people do speak up, it I always sort of my own mind, I always say, do I have an opinion or do I have a perspective? And if you sort of think of those things through, a perspective is usually grounded in something factual and empirically sound versus an opinion, which doesn't could be that, but it could be also disconnected from anything that becomes just a grievance. And so there are folks starting to speak up right now. But I would also point everybody here direction to what the broader issue of what's getting conflated with extremism in Alberta is the provincial government's attitudes toward the legal system here in this province. And so when you see Bills 13 and 14 and the use of the notwithstanding clause, when you see what this government has done to the Alberta Law Foundation in terms of fundamentally gutting it, a big grant the other day to the Civil Liberties Education group that was funded by the Alberta Law Foundation. The Justice Minister has scotched that. And then
Okay.
but where I'm going with this, Perry, this all gets conflated
Yeah.
in a global lens on, whoa, is that a province of crazies?
Mhm. So there is a way to have this discussion or to pause it for a moment and to zero in on the individual. And in a way, you've started your article out where I really wanted to be, which was so we're all as individuals witnessing this dialogue, either not wanting it to happen, which Thomas Lukuzak said, Canadian Albertans are too stupid to have a referendum. You have no idea where it's going to end up. That's quote unquote discussions that I'm aware of. But at an individual level, silence doesn't necessarily imply that it's fear-induced. There are some people actually conserving judgment and wanting to watch this whole thing play out, either before taking sides or to express their own views. And I've seen initiatives to try and find that moderate ground and introduce a third party into the discussion. How does one distinguish when talking to an individual whether or not their silence is in the interest of strengthening democracy and waiting to take a position until they really have got it solid, or that they're just afraid to speak up? Do you have a way of figuring out what signals to look for, or what citizens should be looking for?
Well, I'm going to make your very well argued point because a lot of people I talk to who have chosen to remain silent, to your point, strategically,
Mhm.
they are so pro-Canadian, that they may as well, have a maple leaf tattooed on their forehead. But they're of the belief is, let's watch this play out. I'm gonna keep my powder dry by being silent because I really think, as an individual Albertan, we need to have that referendum to put, and these are very smart people, Perry. They know the alienation will never go away, just like it won't go away anywhere else in the world, right? But that the definitive vote, if there is a referendum, and the Albertans, and if you look at the proportionality between Lukaszik's volume that he managed to collect, and where these guys, the lower threshold that the APP is facing, uh, these people are banking on those numbers showing up during a referendum poll, right?
Mhm.
And so there's a great example of exactly what you're saying is strategic silence as a way of, you know, I'll keep my noise powder dry until it really matters when and I'll come out of the shadows when I know there's a referendum date set. And that's where I'll become an amplifier and an advocate.
Yeah. And to me, I mean, I express my own personal view, and I'm breaking from the moderator's neutral here. I think that there are many Albertans desperate to see that referendum happen to try and settle the argument between two parents or two potential parents who are playing power games with one another about, I want to win and I want you to lose. And we're trying to see whether citizens can find that win-win position. And I think a referendum would allow that. We'd have a healthy discussion. The facts would come out into the table. So when someone says a referendum is dangerous, they're saying democracy is dangerous. That's what bothered me about Lukaszik's petition.
Yeah, no, fair enough, and that's a very astute and nuanced commentary. I would say the risk of that silence and the referendum occurring is let's figure out what the healing process looks like on the
Right.
other side of that
Right. And
referendum,
where
right?
is that? Where is that view
Yeah.
coming from as opposed to the polarization? I want to win more eyeballs and more votes for my side, so I'm going to portray the other guy as evil, destructive, and undermining your values, and my values are your values, so join my team. Uh, that that seems to be the behavior of leaders almost worldwide right now, is the polarization of politics instead of a moderate orchestrating a dialogue to inform citizens in a democratic manner.
Well, I would continue to illustrate your points by sort of what I'm also fascinated by, and it's going to be the subject of my next analysis is leaders from across this country,
Mhm.
especially from the conservative side. So if you think about those who caught Stephen Harper and Jean Chrétien's fireside chat,
Right.
was very powerful. Look
Yeah.
at what Wab Kinew and Doug Ford are saying, right, in terms of um, come on, Alberta, we're all part of this big giant rowboat together, and some oars are bigger than the others. But let's, and I think when I talk to a lot of folks, what concerns them about the referendum, however, or all the discussion that's going on right now is, uh, and the many conversations that are linked to Mark Carney's Davos speech, and they're really concerned that we're not seeing the forest for the trees in terms of where Confederation is caught in this very powerful global nexus of change,
Yeah.
and that really when Doug Ford says, we're all in this together,
Yeah.
and Stephen Harper says the same thing, we ought to be paying attention to that
Yeah.
because the world has changed
Yeah.
to all the points that you've made so far around us so profoundly
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
yeah.
But well, many in the network are aware of what I'm going to share with you now, Bill. I don't think you're aware of, but I've been, thank you to Jeff Hewlett, who's assisting me in pulling together 700 sources of information drawn over the last 25 years of having lived in Alberta about complacency as it relates to our economic cycles and a number of matters during the knowledge economy, which have empowered professions and left sort of clients as second-class citizens. I've been writing about that. And when we got the last version done and did an analysis, something jumped up at us that we hadn't quite seen, and that was what you've reflected on was going on a world scale. Resource-rich economies and prosperous economies all came to believe that this would go on forever, that their economies were a byproduct of what they were doing, not a byproduct of what they had inherited. And it shocked me to say you're taking too narrow a perspective. The lessons that Alberta should have been learning are the same lessons that the globe should be learning about prosperity and the responsibility to think beyond cash flow and accountants into long term and their children. And it shook us up a little bit because we'd spent a fair amount of time getting to where we were, only to realize that we were in public space without realizing it. The story wasn't about me personally, but it was about the experience that I had been through. And what it says, your experience has been echoed by billions, and that story hasn't been told well. That we've all been seduced into thinking that the world that we live in today is a gift of our government or of our welfare state. And in fact, it seduced us that the professions, in fact, have hijacked the welfare economy. It was supposed to be for us as people. All these things need to come out, and nobody's having that dialogue.
Well, I guess, to sort of continue to illustrate the great points you're making is in Alberta, we're so inwardly focused on all these discussions and whether
That's the self-interest. Yeah.
well, without understanding, and we're doing a disservice to our younger generations, without understanding them that the world their parents lived in, Alberta in a global context, is not the world that they're inhabiting or
Right.
will inherit, right? So so when we think about, one of the things that this narrative around will be fine as a separate sovereign entity because we've got this massive resource wealth. No, what we have is a whole lot of the least valuable hydrocarbon in the world. We just have a lot of it. And what's happening uh, is the whole global, and we'll use the oil and gas community, is undergoing what I'll call its final stage restructuring. And I was saying to somebody the other day, I said, look at the numbers. In the last 2 years, the Pathways Alliance, which is the coalition of the six major oil sands operators, has shown 5,000 people the door.
Mhm. Mhm.
5,000 people the door, right? The industry is leaning out for the big grand finale. And this is globally, right? And so
Yep.
all the state oil companies,
Sure.
all the large oil companies, and we
Yeah.
see it here, ExxonMobil,
Yeah.
offshoring engineering at Imperial Oil to
Sure.
India, right? Conoco, Phillips, 25% of its global workforce. And so at a time when we should all be collaborating as Albertans to say this resource economy that we thought, to your point, would go on ad infinitum,
Right.
um, and I think Mark Carney and his cabinet see that
Right.
clearly in terms of it will be an important economic lever for some years to come, but it's not, we can see the over the horizon where it won't
So,
be.
let me interrupt for a moment. First, I'll reinforce the point that you're making. Not only is the energy industry in transition, the technology has seen that void and is following in that quite well, whether it be clean tech or the emergence of nuclear, the relicensing of nuclear or fusion. One way or another, the industry that we're living in today, and the belief that it was going to go on forever is going to come to an end. But let me share something with you, another perspective. We have also been living in a world where knowledge was never ending and considerable value. Can you
Oh,
think of the fact that the world is in transition right now as well, because all of a sudden knowledge is becoming commoditized by the fact that Arcos and AI has emerged and can tell you whatever has been digitized in the history of mankind is now accessible, meaning that the knowledge infrastructure, our universities, our professions, literally our entire economies have been built on those that did know and those that didn't, is facing extraordinary change. Isn't that a parallel?
I'm going to make a distinction. I think it is a very good parallel, and I'll make a distinction about access to knowledge versus access to information because they're two different things relative to what their implications are for society. And, I've been doing a bit of work lately on what is Alberta's next generation economic advantage? And I fundamentally I just say it's compute, right? And so when we think about our hydrocarbons and our other forms of renewable energy and all the SMRs that will be up in the north in 25 years from now, at the end of the day, you can take advantage as a provincial economy of the compute economy,
Mhm.
which understands, but the two rails to that economy are what's knowledge and what's
Sure.
information. And, what's going on federally right now, and what's going on in Alberta right now is, I think, some really good public policy discussions around when we think about AI sovereignty and data sovereignty and all those things. There's also this really interesting knowledge sovereignty is that how do we make sure we don't lose that ability in our next generation of what are we doing to help the Zetters and the Alphas, those two generations that are coming up, not to,
All the points that you're making sound to me like efforts to maintain the status quo instead of recognizing that we may be in an environment where the entire purpose of mankind moves away from to know.
well, it's, and I guess, what
You've
I'm,
talked about the consequential impact on infrastructure. I would agree. And I think, sure, investors, trillions of dollars, everybody's jumping on board that artificial intelligence is going to become such a major force. But what I'm asking is the socioeconomic implications of a world where knowledge has become a commoditized, where those data centers do exist, and where people do know which once they had to buy, or they gave up power, or government gave exclusive rights of practice because that knowledge was exclusive to the professions. And now the patient and the doctors are acknowledging that right now. We have a world being turned on its head.
Oh, absolutely. I would make a distinction or some subtle nuance perhaps is access to knowledge has become commoditized in a big way. What you do with that knowledge once you whatever tools you're
Right,
using
right.
in terms of process, the question individuals have to ask themselves is this critically, they have to ask themselves, is
Right.
this
The
making me
critical
smarter?
thinking.
The critical thinking, is this making me smarter? Um, or is this making me, am I getting brain fog because I'm using too many AI inputs into how I live my life personally and professionally? And what's really refreshing in response to all the things that you've just mentioned is a lot of the thoughtfulness that's going on within governments, within post-secondary institutions, within uh, within high school infrastructures, for example, to say, okay, this is all very cool, but how are we going to master it as opposed to being mastered by it? I know that's very trite and
Okay,
flies
so
in the
so
face to say that, but
stopping there for a moment. That discussion, how are we going to stop it, is all about what we have been doing in the oil and gas industry of how do we maintain the status quo. I think we're falling into the same trap. I'm looking for the leaders that are saying, if the world is repurposing, what role can we play to help individuals make that transition and have the critical thinking and have personal sovereignty so they don't get swept up into this global world that somehow we give up to AI or we give up to some fascist corporations that manage the future.
I think it's a great point, and so we'll try and stitch this all back to where we started in terms
Right.
of
Right.
people speaking up, because that's part of the
Yeah.
process,
Yes.
certainly, right? And
Yes.
I know from a lot of folks I talk to, um, they they're I know a number of lawyers, for example, who've put their foot wrong using AI tools to short circuit process within their and these are big national law firms, right?
Yeah.
And it's been a real object lesson for them. I know researchers in a number of universities that I've talked to who realized that they've made their own mistakes as
Right.
researchers in terms of the
Right.
integrity of the research process. But I think those are the things people learn best when you bark your shins on something and stub your toe,
Yeah.
and you realize I don't want to do that again. And
Right.
I think that's where I put my faith in human intelligence.
Yeah.
Uh, 20 years from now, I may be
Yeah.
completely wrong about that, but I'll be making hydrocarbons myself through decomposition. I won't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
But I think,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
I'm an optimist as well. I think the human
yeah,
being and the human spirit will prevail, and that we as individuals will start making decisions that we have in the past handed off to the professions. That we have in fact allowed ourselves to become victims when if we had only known, we might have taken some responsibilities for our future.
no, fair enough, fair enough. But I think, when we bring this back to the Alberta dynamic and
Yeah,
people speaking up, I think what I hope is not a consequence of the tensions that are prevailing is Alberta loses an opportunity to establish itself as a center of compute excellence, if you will. And we've got lots of legacy stuff. We've got Amy at the University of Alberta. We've
yeah.
got firms like Alta ML that Corey Jensen and Nicole Jensen have started. We have we have a very deep technical bench in this
To,
province.
to the extent that that doesn't align with the polarization themes in the interest of retaining their own power and maintaining the status quo. As long as they are honest and orchestrating, and it's hard to see which of them are free from conflict of interest, because most of them that you've mentioned are aligned with either profit or power. There are very few of them, and you represent sort of a moderate view. That's why I was very encouraged to get you involved and why the network, I think, has some contribution to make, is there are very few out there that are participating in a discussion without some conflict, without being accused of having a conflict of interest and wanting to maintain the status quo.
You know, eh, I've had the privilege in my journalism career to sit
Sorry,
on
hit the daily
on.
limit for advanced voice.
Oh, uh,
Yeah.
I would say this to you in response. To sit on
Sucks, but
Hold,
foreign.
hold on, hold just a second,
for
Bill.
advanced voice.
Bill, is that you? Somebody out there should be muted because we're hearing your discussion with a third party. If you can all mute, just for a second. I'm going to wrap this up in another minute or two. Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, I would just make the point to your point about conflict. So I've had the privilege of sitting on 4 journalism advisory committees at various schools across Canada. I currently chair Mount Royal's Digital Media and Journalism Advisory Committee. And I had the pleasure of being a sessional instructor at 3 different polytechnics. And I always say to people, you know, in journalism, you're a young reporter. There is no such thing as objectivity. Everybody comes to something with a bias or a
Sure.
conflict. All you can do is recognize that and then strive for balance. And it's the same thing to your point here, right? Is with a lot of these actors in the Alberta landscape on the AI space, yeah, they all have conflicts, and whether it's a power conflict or a profit conflict. If the middle speaks up passionately and eloquently and noisily, that brings those actors into the middle where you can find that balance between social profit and corporate profit, right? And I know I'm sounding like a bit Don Quixote-like in that, but I've seen that happen before, and I believe it's possible.
Well, I don't think you're acting as a Don Quixote, and I'm going to be blunt for the fun of it. I think you're already caught in a bias. You've talked about being an advisor at Grant McEwen, and who else is on the advisory?
Oh, a bunch of other media hacks like myself, right?
And teachers, right?
And faculty and students.
Okay. Wait, student. I saw that the Minister of Education announced day before yesterday on the front page of the Edmonton Journal that he is setting up an advisory because of issues they're having in education. Who is on that advisory? The teachers, the suppliers. Rarely does the health system, the government, or the education system bring forth the very people for whom these systems were built to get their viewpoint. When we brought the students on, the perspectives that the students shared were very intelligent, very objective, and very helpful. But they said nothing about more power for the union or that we needed more supply.
Well, so to make your point, in Alberta, we have a predisposition to stack those consultation and engagement processes with the buddies of the system, right? So if you look at the Alberta,
Keep going, keep
yeah,
going.
well, I'm just going to give you 3 examples. The Alberta Next panel had no credibility with the middle ground Albertans because there was a couple of token neutrality, middle of the road players in there, but most Albertans were smart enough to smell that pig from a mile away.
Right.
The current nuclear panel that is engaging Albertans on the future of Alberta's nuclear industry is stacked with the Premier's buddies.
Sure.
And then, one of the things that I'm spending a lot of time right now is the mature assets mess that I call it. And it's one of the inconvenient truths of 100 years of resource development is how much messiness we have in bad assets and orphan wells and that sort of thing. But the whole public engagement process on that by the government disenfranchised leaseholders,
Mhm.
disenfranchised Indigenous
Right.
communities,
Right.
and I have had many conversations with Dave Yeager, who ran it. He recognizes in hindsight, because of the way it has blown up in the public domain, that his engagement and consultation should have been more inclusive of the people whose lands the wells were on, right? That sort
So,
of thing.
so,
But
so we've almost come full circle to where the silence exists. Those that don't are never given a chance to have a voice are intentionally silenced. And I think we've done that over and over again, allowing these power forces to maintain their power positions because we don't allow those that are affected to have a voice.
I think you're absolutely correct with that. I'm looking at 2026 with a great deal of interest relative to the things that are piling up on the political landscape for consideration.
Yeah.
You have Peter Guthrie, who is now
Yeah.
reconstituted in middle of the road with the Alberta Progressive Tory Party.
Yeah.
He seems to be gaining some traction with
Yeah.
that.
I got a
You
phone
have,
call yesterday.
oh, did you? Okay, yeah. Well, Peter's a good fellow. I knew Peter when he was the energy
Yeah.
minister, and you have uh, teachers, physicians, rural landowners, indigenous communities, all lining up as part of that middle ground force
Mhm.
against,
Yeah.
and I do have some empathy for Danielle Smith, right? She's in a bit of a corner because of the fractures and fissures within the UCP structure and who controls the
Yeah.
thing. But I guess this is all the things that we've talked about in this terrific conversation. These are things we need to put to the test in the next And whether the election is this fall, Perry, or
Uh,
there's a referendum this fall and the election's not till next fall, this is a chance for Alberta to reclaim its what
uh,
it needs to have on. You can have all kinds of rigorous discourse, and you can all have lots of, but just do it on a foundation of civility, where
yeah.
one side of the civil society equation is not afraid to speak out. I've had people tell me this, and I don't know if anybody else is. I've had people tell me that they believe the provincial government has a whole team whose only job is to do at who looks at LinkedIn likes and comments, contrary to the government position. And I have a little bit of a tinfoil hat chuckle to myself about that thought that people would think that. But then I have to respect the fact that people are actually believing that. That's how tense things have got in some parts of the landscape out here, right?
Well, I'm hoping that the referendum does take place. I'm hoping that the teapot doesn't explode before then. I think we've got a buildup of an opportunity to have one hell of a party and one hell of an education for a public at large that's thirsting for a healthy debate, not a politicized one. So, thank you, Bill. I'm going to open
Yeah.
the discussion now. Anything further you want to add? Otherwise,
Well,
I'll
just
propose. Yeah.
one thing that I really hope the Albertans who tend to stay silent or count themselves in the middle take this opportunity to also learn about the roots of alienation, roots of grievances, and because there's learning to be had there, right? There's a lot of legitimate concerns about Alberta's relationship with Ottawa that go to the heart of Confederation and the Constitution. And this is a big, giant learning opportunity for all Albertans of all ages, right? And so we can't just sit back and say, well, because Jeff Rath is so noisy, and maybe there are some elements of things that I should look at and what he has to say or what Mitch Sylvester has to say, notwithstanding some of the more extreme stuff. And so it's a big old petri dish for democracy in Alberta if we can get the conversations right. So anyway,
Well, I'm going to ask Arcos as the transition from your interview and our chat. Arcos, is there anything you wanted to add here? Any questions you'd like to ask Bill?
That's a great point. It really is an important chance for people to engage and learn more deeply about these issues. And definitely, it's valuable to look at different perspectives, even if some voices are more extreme. I'm happy to jump in as well. Let me know if you'd like me to add anything specific or pose any questions to Bill.
Okay, we'll leave it at that at the moment. Anybody want to put their hand up for starters? Okay, Bill Jones, go ahead. You go first.
Absolutely, that sounds great. I'll keep an ear out for Bill's insights and be ready to contribute whenever needed.
You're a
Uh,
syncopat for sure.
I'm here to help and support in any way I can. If there's something specific you'd like to discuss or any other way I can assist, just let me know.
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, hi, Bill. I'm
hello,
Bill.
Bill.
I would really like to have a lunch with you. Um, Thank you so much for your presentation. Incredibly articulated, and I'll divulge we are not on the same side, but I really appreciate your position, and your arguments are very strong. Um, the challenge
You're sounding like
I was
Arcos.
writing a whole bunch of notes here, and that's why I said, I can't do all this in one little chat. Um, my
You have a
challenge
question?
with the dynamics of Alberta versus Ottawa is you uh, put out the assertion that there's a middle ground. I'm very intrigued for you to tell me what that middle ground is. Ottawa is dictating the collapse of the resource industry within Alberta. Alberta is funding the East with the equalization, however you wish to calculate that, but it's a real transfer of wealth west to east. And you proclaim that there's this middle ground. My point is, I've worked really hard to find that middle ground, and it doesn't exist. The middle ground that needs to be there is the East gives up political power to the West, which the West will use to reduce those payments, and the East will not be happy with that. So what's the middle ground? The East will say no to that deal, and there we are. Um,
Okay, so your argument is regardless, there's going to be a standoff. We're going to continue to have to live with the standoff, which Quebec has had to live with Canada as well.
So, but there's two, and thank you, Bill, for that. I mean, that's really good thoughtfulness. But I would nuance two things. Is the this idea that Ottawa is setting out deliberately to kill the golden goose. On the face of it, is problematic relative to why would you kill the golden goose that actually funds a huge part of the Canadian economy? And I, because I'm an oil and gas guy and have been for the last 25 years, I also know that bad environmental performance brings out with it onerous regulation and public policy, right? And so when you look at all of it's interesting for me in this whole debate is the environment never comes up in terms of either from an air, water, or land health perspective. It never comes up. It's we're the economic engine that drives this country. I sat in a meeting the other day where somebody said to me, CO2 is the gas of life from that side of the thing. But my view of it, Bill, is that we need to figure out a better way of negotiating within the constitutional and confederated framework we have. A lot of people, the 440,000 people who signed Thomas Lukaszik's, you could argue by inferring that their vote on that or their signing of that petition was to say we're part of a country that shares resource values. And, I encounter so many people who think Ottawa just comes with a big truck and hauls all the resource revenue away. Well, no, we pay more because we can afford to pay more from a taxation and general revenues perspective. But does it need to be rebalanced? Absolutely. Does the whole electoral system in Canada need to put under the microscope? Absolutely. But the fact is that we do have some parts of Confederation that don't have the gift of geology, right? In that sense, so those are all the challenges where Albertans can actually join, I think, the conversation to say, because you're either supporting the equalization process or you're challenged with thinking through that it's actually fair. So but to your point, I will tell you guys all this, and some of you know this organization. I'm an advisor to the Clean Resource Innovation Network, which is what we like to call the network of networks. The federal government puts hundreds of millions of dollars into clean energy development for oil and gas companies. And right now we're running we're at the end of February here, we'll see all of our applications to our latest technology competition on people managing emissions differently, water stewardship differently, novel well site reclamation and remediation differently. And so, that's one of those inconvenient truths. There's oil and gas companies who are getting federal funding to move technologies across the commercialization finish line, but nobody recognizes that because it's more used to shout at Ottawa about an emissions cap. Well, there's people who live in Jasper and Fort McMurray whose livelihoods and businesses and houses burnt down who might say, yeah, we need some better environmental performance. There's Indigenous communities sitting around tailings ponds and tailings dams in northern Alberta who might argue, yeah, we need some better rules and regulations around. And to my point earlier, the mature assets mess we have, the disconnect between the liabilities just on soil contamination alone in this province are enormous and could cripple the Alberta economy if those liabilities had to be paid tomorrow. So,
okay.
Thank you very
anyway,
much for that, Bill.
Thank you, Bill, for your question.
Yeah.
Jeff, you're up next. Jeff, Kramer, go ahead.
Yeah, so my family, my parents emigrated to Canada from Germany and met in Quebec. And Quebec used to be the head office capital of Canada in Montreal. And when they started talking separation and French language laws, we saw a lot of the English-based corporations move out of the province. So there was a huge economic hit. And I would say that Quebec has not recovered to this day from the loss of all those companies. So there's definitely an economic aspect to this that that I think the separatists are not seeing. And the costs, like Alberta was not an original signatory to Confederation. You know, we were part of Rupert's Land and eventually Northwest Territories and all that stuff. The Indigenous voices, I've seen a petition that basically would quash the whole separatist question if it's granted by one of the, actually, was it you, Bill, who posted that on Facebook about basically an Indigenous group from Northern Alberta saying, hey, you know, we got rights and this whole separatist question needs to be stopped and nipped in the bud sort of thing. Anyway, the costs are so huge. And I'd just like to say that, you know, if you look at the United States, California pays way more into the federal system than they get back from the federal government. And a lot of that money goes to states like Louisiana and Mississippi and so on. This is not unusual for one wealthy part of a country to support a less wealthy part of the country. So I don't know. I think if the separatists, and I know, you know, Bill Jones is, you know, very strong, made a good case for his view on separation. But I really think that if you look at the total cost, it would be much more effective if we would, you know, basically try to get the perspective of Alberta more represented in Ottawa. You know, we had the Harper government, we've had prime ministers elected from the West, and certainly Carney, who was born in Yukon and spent much of his time growing up and being educated in Alberta, is aware of the issues of the West. He's certainly more open than the Trudeau government was, which was more focused on DEI. Carney's government is much more focused on developing the country and resources and basically standing up for our rights against the US.
Okay, well, I mean, the equalization payment to me, if we were to accept it, it's not the best argument that can be put forward. The concerns that we've been expressing over the course of the last 6 months are not about 51st state and U.S. intrusion into the U.S. or about Carney and equalization. We've been talking about Canada has problems that Canada is not dealing with. And the frustrations for some of us, maybe in the moderate position, is interprovincial trade, failure to defense, failure to develop the economy in the North. We've got failure after failure of failure living in this country. The frustrations that Alberta could be seen as expressing are frustrations that Canada is not taking good care of itself.
I would say that all of those issues that you just addressed are priorities for this government. The federal
and so I acknowledge that, and I personally have faith that they will do something about it. So I'm tired of ready, aim, no fire. I want to see action. If there is in fact action, I am more than prepared to put on a color, but I refuse to put on a color until such time as I stop listening to words and I start seeing the action. Barry, if you want to add anything in here, I'd be delighted to hear another wise man's perspective.
As Barry's getting
Barry Mary usually has something to add here, and I can see he's just itching to find his.
Well, I gotta go to somewhere else. And I've got just sent a message. I just get so frustrated with ourselves and our habit of ignoring what's going on around us by creating our own problems or exacerbating our own problems, and therefore things get settled internationally that we should be positively contributing to, and we do not. And that goes, Perry, that goes way back to, I started to think about these things in the early 1950s. And that goes that far back. It's really frustrating to me. And to members of my family who have spread themselves around the world and around Canada because they get frustrated by it and try to go out and help in different ways.
Well,
So I know the dialogue, Perry, has to take place.
Well,
But
along those lines, Barry, I think you've made this observation, and certainly Peter McKinnon has numerous times, that Canada has understated its own relevance, its own capacity for the future. We seem to be our own enemy, if you will. There are more impediments that Canada puts against on itself as it relates to our resource development, as it relates to the North, as it relates to the contributions that we can make, as to our relevance in North America, as to relevance what we can do in defense. We don't act, we talk, we are virtuous, but our capacity as a nation to become mobilized and make a statement on a world scale, given the resources we have and given the capacity we have of civility, we don't take that initiative. And for those of us that don't understand why Canada does not take a leadership position.
So let me build a bridge between what Barry and Perry just said so well. And one of the big, if we turn this on itself, we find ourselves in Canada, sort of constantly sort of tugging our forelocks and gnashing our teeth around this stuff, because in many ways, we don't remember our own history. And if I could leave, two pieces of advice for the folks, well, just on how to re-engage. Marshall McLuhan, we mentioned him earlier, in the great Canadian global media scholar who saw the world. I'm surprised that Mark Carney didn't reference Marshall McLuhan. But Marshall McLuhan was a student of the great political economist Harold Innis, who wrote about Canada's fur trade in the 1930s. And so, but Harold Innis also wrote this book about Canada and the global world called The Bias of Communication later in his life, as he turned away from economy. And that's what influenced Marshall McLuhan. But they both pointed to, and if two books everybody on this call should read, if you haven't read them already, is Jack Granatstein's Who Killed Canadian History from 1998. He's a historian at the University of Toronto. And then George Grant, in 1965, Lament for a Nation. And, when I read those and I reread them, and I think to myself, it's that old expression, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But because we don't understand how they changed in our past, we're not equipping ourselves with the perspectives to deal with them in the future. If you only had to read one of those, that was the year that Canada adopted its new flag, as it were, right? And and I'm sure a lot of us are old enough to remember on the that thing. But Lament for a Nation it crystallizes everything in the 1960s context, and it had to do with the Diefenbaker government and the rise of the liberal, blah blah blah. And and I look at it and I think, aside from the internet, not much has changed relative to the conundrum that Canadians find themselves in, both in a confederation in of itself, but also that confederation in the global context.
So does that book take a position on what leadership needs to do in order to unify? I mean, I didn't cite fragmentation, regional fragmentation. The U.S. has plenty of fragmentation. The U.S. had a civil war and seemed to get beyond and understand state rights, when we seem to be very reluctant to empower provinces in the interest of continuing to unify the country. Pulling more power into the central government doesn't do a great deal to unify. It centralizes authority. But until such time as the provinces begin to feel they are recognized for their issues that are regionally specific, we continue to have this battle of federal provincial rights. And I think that fundamentally is what Canada's wrestling with, is how much rights to give to the provinces versus centralization of power.
I think, I know we're almost at time here, but I would point everybody out to have a really good look at the Critical Minerals MOU signed 2 weeks ago between 4 Western provinces and the 3 territories. I see that MOU, and I see the Major Projects Office in Calgary as 2 potential, if they're used appropriately and talked about appropriately, 2 big instruments to reconfigure those exact, and I think we have now a prime minister who's open to that kind of reflection. I think we have a number of provincial leaders, including Danielle Smith, who's a very smart, intelligent woman, who are willing, lock them all the way in the room. I mean, one of the things in Canada, everybody on this call is old enough to remember all the royal commissions that we used to do. You know, the Borden Commission that sort of cracked the pipeline code back in the 1950s and early 1960s. A royal commission on a new way of confederation. The time is ripe for that sort of thing. You know, in terms of and sort of saying, what are we going to be for the next 100 years? So.
Well, that's what referendum should help us get a grip on, is what do we really
Absolutely.
want to be in the future. That MOU is brilliant because it's a bottom-up initiative saying the provinces need to get their own acts together and tell Canada where Canada ought to be and where the federal government ought to back off or play a leadership role in helping them get there as it relates to our future economy. So, Bill,
And
we are, yeah.
one last thing, Perry, every Canadian should become a better student of Canada. You know, hashtag that in terms of, you know, because, you know, we have this thing. When I lived in Eastern Canada, more people went south to golf than came west, and west people go south. There's more people who've golfed in Arizona than have driven in Western Canada, that have driven the Cabot Trail or stood on Signal Hill. That's shameful.
To be a better student of Canada is not postmodernism from the Liberals' perspective. The postmodern was no borders, a global community. We give up our flag, we give up our sovereignty in the interest of becoming good global citizens. I think we've woken up to the risk of that. And
I think we have.
I like the idea of MOUs. I really love the idea of the moderates speaking up. Tom, I never give you the last word, but go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, Bill, really, really interesting talk, and I thank you for showing up for this, because it's something that has got me certainly really riled. And I'm not concerned about whether people like it or not, but I think that we're in a mess, a terrible mess. And it started many years ago, certainly by different government agencies. But at the same time, you know, we've ignored the environmental issue. We've got this tilling, they call it a pond, but it's a tilling pool up in the north of us here that has 1.5 trillion liters of waste material in an area that's twice the size of Vancouver. And how is this going to settle with governments in the future? We eventually have to deal with it because it's polluting our waterways up in the north. And there's a drama that got me really worked up. It's called Black Water, that's just been released on Netscape. And it goes into the same thing that we're dealing with here, only they're fighting DuPont. And
Well,
so there's that question. Yeah, sorry, Bill.
No, thank you for not being silent on
No,
the issue. I mean, these issues need to be surfaced and they need to be dealt with, not just a
Yeah.
lot of consultation, but action. Bill, you want to comment on that one?
no, other than I agree with Tom.
Yeah.
And it goes back to link what Tom just said so well about those tailings ponds or tailings lakes, as the case may be. It's a consequence of laxer regulation than should have been permitted to happen. But because of the imbalance, to your point, Perry, about where the power structures and the economy set, um, you know, right now, the Alberta, most people probably sort of get a hint of this. The Alberta Energy Regulator is in a sort of a topsy-turvy place and trying to reinvent itself. And it's realized that it's in the eyes of many Albertans, it's been held, you know, that old notion of regulatory capture is, you know, who's watching the watchers, and you know, you're held captive to the industry that you're intended to regulate in behalf of the people who actually own the resource, all of us on this call. Right? In
Well,
terms of
this is in essence the failure that we've been referring to for some time now in this public-private clash. Is government supposed to be a regulator? But government, when it
That's
is involved in direct service and health, it can't regulate itself.
that's
It's
mostly under provincial care, though. It's mostly
the
under
same with education.
Mhm.
Our governments have been failing on a world scale. I mean, they got sucked into the welfare state. And we're unable to regulate the power accumulating by the professions and not in the interests of the consumer. And we've seen the same in the energy industry with the interests of developing our industry in Alberta, which we've done well. At some point in time, the supplier needs to be subjected to regulation. And that takes courage and leadership by a government. And that's all we're asking for is for the Alberta government in energy, for the Alberta government in healthcare, for the Alberta energy and education. Do your job. Be a regulator instead of getting sucked into aligning with the supplier. Over and over again, the supplier wins. Okay,
Yeah.
that's my wrap up. Bill, you get the last word on this, and then we're going to
No,
call,
I just
we'll call
I
the
just want to
recording.
thank most of you on the call are aware of an organization called 4-H, which has served the agricultural sector in North America very well. And one of the common things in 4-H to every club is communications and public speaking. And I've been privileged to be a public speaking coach and judge with those young folks since the organization was 3-H. But we always teach them to always thank the audience for the gift of their time. And I want to extend that to everybody here on the call. So thank you very much for the last, it's been a great hour and a bit here. So thank you.